Welcome to the 184th episode of the Reading and Writing Podcast. I'm your host, Jeff Rutherford. Stay tuned for my interview with Lyndsay Faye, author of the historical thriller novel, The Fatal Flame. Stay tuned for the interview. Welcome back to the Reading and Writing Podcast. My guest today is Lyndsay Faye. Faye is the author of the historical thriller novels Gods of Gotham, Dust and Shadow, and Seven for a Secret. Her latest novel, The Fatal Flame, has just been published. Lyndsay, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you so much for having me.
Great. Well, can you read a couple of pages from your new novel, The Fatal Flame?
Definitely. Yeah, I'd be happy to. Spoiler free, so I'll start with the prologue.
Great.
Dunma Odufi, as she had been called in the green mother country, where the rocks pierced the grasslands the way gaunt collarbones pierced the peaceful, slumbering corpses in the streets, recalled what it felt like to be hungry, to long for thick brown bread with salt, to taste pipe smoke on her tongue as if it were solid charred beef, to find mushrooms in a tree stump and sell them for whiskey, not out of recklessness, but because mushrooms could barely touch her appetite, while a pint of whiskey might help her forget her ravenous belly for an entire day, with care. Maybe two. Dunla Duffy, as they called her in New York City, remembered Ireland with a fondness that lingered like the mists which used to flinch away from the doorstep of her hovel when the stern sun rose, because Dunla Duffy wasn't hungry anymore. These days, Dunla was starving. When I was a younger version of Timothy Wilde, not Copper Star 107 of the New York City Police Department, but a Kinchin running feral through the streets, I knew hungry like I knew my own name. But I've never known starving. And if my brother Valentine had never done me a single other good turn in his mad life, that would have been enough. He did more for me than that, of course. But if I get ahead of myself, I'll never manage to put any of this on paper. Just before dawn, on the day we met, Dunla and I, she sat in the corner of a ground floor chamber in Pell Street, listlessly hemming ankle cuffs in the rented room she shared with other malls who did manufactory outwork in their living quarters. Trousers were heaped into ziggurats throughout the room, waiting for the brutal sunrise and for the women to rouse themselves. Both the workers and their wares were on the splintering floor, furniture being a luxury. Both were, by Manhattan standards, worthless, because the year was 1848, and the British Isles hadn't glimpsed a potato that wasn't blackly leprous since 1845. At daybreak, others like Dunma would arrive. Such women were similar to the piles of garbage heaped on our street corners. No one wanted to look at them, and there would be more the next day. "You thief," snarled a crone's voice from the opposite corner. Dunma, distracted by a rash that had recently bloomed along her limbs like frenzied spring wildflowers, didn't reply. "You're a thief." The room's 12 other residents stirred fitfully at the noise. Dunla managed with an effort she found frankly unfair to raise her head. As Dunla informed us later, she was 14 years old. Her huge eyes stood out pale green from straggling locks of equally green and greasy hair framing her round face. She'd once owned pale copper tresses and couldn't quite recollect how they'd faded to the color of rotting corn silk. I worked out the mystery of her seaweed bright curls for myself eventually, of course, as I have a tendency to unravel puzzles, for all the meager good it does my acquaintances. Dunla did remember that with her sweetly blank expression and her unnerving eyes, the villagers had given her wary glances when she was a child. But her mother had once lifted her high in the air toward the full silver moon and called Dunla her brightest light, brighter even than the Gaelic gnon about their heads. Whenever Dunla's imagination attempted to reproduce fresh butter and failed, she thought about being someone's moon. Dunla, to be truthful, because Christ knows the tale is too grim to be anything but true, was simple, but she managed in spite of the fact. "The moon seems far off and all," she told me on the day she watched my heart break, "but the tide still comes in. Don't it now?" From Dunla, I learned that people, like deities, can move in mysterious ways.
Great. Well, if someone listening hasn't heard about The Fatal Flame yet, how would you describe your new novel?
It's the third in the Timothy Wilde trilogy, and Timothy Wilde is essentially, I set out to write day one, cop one of the NYPD. I had, everyone loves books like The Alienist, right? Caleb Carr, all of these wonderful sort of end of the 19th century, 1890s, 1910s, sort of, Teddy Roosevelt era, late Victorian period, even though calling it Victorian kind of doesn't really apply to America. But anyway, but so I had seen and read so many of these, and I loved them. But I had never read a book that was about how the police were formed the very first year, and that turns out to have been 1845. And New York City already had a population of 400,000 people before we had a police force. So I found that fascinating, and I just delved into the research. And The Gods of Gotham is really about the founding of the police. The sequel, Seven for a Secret, continues that story. And The Fatal Flame, the thread in The Fatal Flame is that the main thrust of the narrative is it's about the very first manufactory workers and women who were beginning to work outside the home. It's 1848. It's the same year as the Seneca Falls, the first female rights convention was held. And women were in a very interesting position during that time period because they were supposed to be wholly domestic and, kind of decorative. But if you were unfortunate enough to lose your father or your husband or if you did not have male support, then your choices were basically either to find male support again or starve because there were no jobs in place for women other than doing this manufacturing work and sewing work. And women were beginning to want fair wages for that, and they were beginning to strike as early as 1837. So The Fatal Flame is essentially about a serial arsonist who is starting to set fires to some of the really low tenements in New York City, and it is all about labor, and it's all about women in the workplace. And this was a very unheard of practice at the time for women to be going out and working at jobs that weren't, on the family farm, that weren't within the home. So yeah, it was a really interesting time period, and that is essentially the thread of the narrative is, about the seamstresses decades and decades before triangle shirtwaist ever happened.
Right. And that's the most famous fire that everyone remembers.
Sure, and that was much later. Yeah.
Right. So I'm curious. I mean, you talked about the alienist and deciding to go back to the beginning. Had you always been interested in New York City history?
Yeah, to a certain extent. I mean, I think I've always been interested in history in the broad sense, definitely, because as a kid, I grew up reading Sherlock Holmes. I grew up reading, all these classics of British literature and Poe, classics of American literature too. But I always was really drawn to that period, and I found it fascinating. So I've lived in New York for 10 years now, and the city itself, I think, it's fascinating. I mean, when my husband and I first moved here, we live in Queens now, but for 9 years we lived north of Harlem in Washington Heights, and it's just, the culture of the city is fascinating. We lived like 5 blocks from Trinity Cemetery, which is the place where George Washington Matzel, who's the police chief in the Timothy Wilde trilogy, who's a real person and was the first police commissioner, he's buried there. He was buried like 5 blocks from my house. So it was kind of, difficult not to become fascinated with New York City history living here.
Sure. And what was the research process like? I mean, you've talked about becoming interested and wanting to set the trilogy at the beginning of the New York City police force. Were you able to actually contact the NYPD, and do they have historical documents that are available, or what was your research process like?
Well, yeah, it was actually pretty interesting. So no, I didn't contact the NYPD because the NYPD, I think, they have a police museum, but it's sort of on again, off again, open,
Right.
and it's quite small. But the city of New York has enormous benefits to the researcher. Anybody who wants to walk into Bryant Park Research Library is going to find ridiculous amounts of data. So I primarily spent my time at two places. One was the New York Historical Society, and the New York Historical Society had all kinds of books that are no longer in print, that were written about the beginning of the police force. There's one by Costello that's interesting, but remarkably little has been written, I think, in terms of historical, in terms of nonfiction books. Remarkably little has been written about the beginning of the NYPD. So I was kind of starting from scratch. So at the New York Historical Society, I found that there was a diary. It's by a fellow named Bell. He was a roundsman who, walked around just on his beat in the, I believe it was early 1850s. So that was one of the earliest ones that I could find. His handwriting's completely atrocious, but his diary's there at the New York Historical Society, and you just find these fascinating things. Like, he reports stuff like there's this sinkhole down in what would be today Chinatown, near the Five Points, and he's like, 2 people have died falling into this pond.
Oh wow.
I mean, I know, and you're reading this and you're like, really? but yeah, I mean, it was pretty gritty stuff. And then the other thing that I found extraordinarily useful is the fact that at the New York Public Library, where I sort of, I tend to spend about 6 months researching a book before I start writing it. So I nursed my vitamin K deficiency down in the microfilm department, because in the microfilm department, I can read all of the newspaper reports from the Herald newspaper going back. Like, I can just read through the year in the Herald and what they were reporting on. So I can read, it's not just the macrocosm of current events. It's the microcosms of the advertisements and, the petty little grievances of people saying, it's so funny. I mean, it's still the same thing now, right? It's like in winter specifically, it's always been this way in New York. You have to, you're responsible for your own property shoveling snow on the sidewalk in front of if you own the property. Right. So there are people in 1845, like, for God's sake, would you just shovel the snow? And I live in Queens now. We bought a house, so I know what shoveling snow is like, and I also know what it's like to walk to the subway when someone has not shoveled their snow. So it's interesting because you can, through these newspapers, I think, really get a flavor of what was going on. And right. I also consult diaries to a large extent, because diaries are very useful as well.
Right. I was actually going to ask you, did the newspapers cover the founding of the police department?
Not really, shockingly little.
Oh, wow. Interesting.
Shockingly, I mean, they started dissing them quite quickly.
That's another thing that still goes on.
Exactly. I mean, they sort of covered, yes, there's a police force now, and it had previously been a system of night watchmen, which was just laughable. They had leather helmets, and it was all volunteer, and as a matter of fact, the fire department was volunteer for decades after the police force was starting to get paid. But people were very leery of a standing army. So even if they weren't widely reporting on the police being founded, they were quite quickly comparing them to Russian police.
Interesting.
Yeah, they got irritated pretty quickly.
So earlier you mentioned that it takes you about 6 months to research before writing a book. I was going to ask you what your writing and research process is like. So do you have a plot kind of outlined before you sit down and start your research, or does it happen simultaneously? What's that like for you?
I think my plot and my research inform each other to a large extent, because here's a good example. People have often asked me, what led you to write this book set in 1845? I mean, it's fascinating. And the year, that's The Gods of Gotham. And so, of course, The Fatal Flame is, the third in the trilogy. But they'll ask, I mean, it's so interesting. It's the year the potato famine landed, and it's the year this great fire, this huge fire happened in New York City, and it's the year the police were founded. This is what led you to do that. And I'm like, well, I I wanted to write about the first cops. So if the first cops had been founded in 1827, it would have been set in 1827. and if the first cops had happened in 1855, it would have been set in 1855.
Right,
but as it happens, it happened in 1845. So I think I have general overarching themes that I know I want to research when I set out to write a book. The Gods of Gotham is largely about religious persecution of the Irish Catholics. Seven for a Secret, the sequel, is very, very largely about the kidnapping of free African Americans who, it's essentially the other half of Solomon Northrup's autobiography, 12 Years a Slave. It's the other side of it. The vigilance committees who are trying to keep this from happening to people. The Fatal Flame largely is about the birth of the feminist movement and about these very first seamstresses, like I was saying, decades before Triangle Shirtwaist. So I know the general gist of what I'm researching when I set out to do it. Often, I will find real historical events that make it into the books, and people who are real. They'll wander in there because I will find fascinating things in my research that do end up in the novels. And it's not just, I have these quotes from the time period at the beginning of all of my chapters, because I find a lot of the attitudes are almost, like too caricatured and unbelievable for people to swallow unless I'm actually quoting something. I'm like, no, look, they really thought that. look, I promise. But this has happened in all of my novels. So at the beginning of the Gods of Gotham, there's a woman who is suffering from postpartum depression, and she's actually doing sewing outwork at the beginning of the Gods of Gotham, and kills her child in a sort of she's hallucinating, she's malnourished, she's just on the brink of despair, and she kills her baby at the very beginning of the Gods of Gotham, and that was a real crime. That actually happened, and I used her real name. In Seven for a Secret, the Vigilance Committee, the gentlemen who populate the Vigilance Committee, a couple of them are fictional, but most of them have real names of the people who actually founded these just volunteer organizations of people of color to try to keep their community from being snatched up in the streets. And in the Fatal Flame, the early feminist movement, there's a lot that's been written about Seneca Falls, but I found in the Herald newspaper this account of it's a random little police account of a woman who was arrested. She was cited for sure. I think that they took her into custody and then they let her go quite quickly with a fine, but she was arrested for wearing trousers. She was cross-dressing at the time. And it was public indecency that they charged her with, wearing men's clothing. And so I read this in the newspaper for that same year, and then I essentially based an entire character on her in The Fatal Flame, and her name is Sally Woods, who's one of my favorite booksellers, by the way. She works for Murder by the Book in Houston, Texas. But I based Sally Woods on her, and Sally Woods is at the time a crossdresser, and she wears trousers, and it's shocking. It's just in the 1840s, everyone is shocked by this, and even her friends are thinking, "You're setting the feminist movement back. You look like a crazy person." And she doesn't care. It's important to her that she wears what she wants. That's so great. I pick these little. So the research part of it, I pick and choose things that really happened, and then they make their way into the books.
That's great. Well, you've talked about the early years of the police force. I wonder, in your research about fires and firefighting in New York history, were there any details or discoveries about that surprised you?
Oh, well, I mean, the firefighting force, it was fascinating, just absolutely fascinating. And, just everything you picture in Gangs of New York with, ridiculously wonderful mustaches and people punching each other in the face. I mean, these fire departments, it was all volunteer forever, right? So Valentine Wilde, the brother of the narrator in the Timothy Wilde trilogy, he's a volunteer firefighter, partly due to profound guilt over an accidental fire that he set when he was very young, and partly due to the fact that this was a really necessary task. This was something that was very, I mean, could you imagine New York City? It's not quite as stone as it is now, and there's a bunch of wood structures, and they're all next to each other, and the minute one of them goes up, everything goes up, right, in flames. Yep. And it's amazing. So these people, the firemen, were gods. I mean, they were just absolutely adored by the public, and even when the firemen deeply misbehaved, the public still forgave them, because these are the people who are running into burning buildings, rescuing people. And at a certain point, when Tammany got really corrupt, Tammany was pretty corrupt from the beginning. Let's be real here. But when it got egregiously corrupt, I mean, you've got some fire gangs that they were gangs. I mean, they were essentially gangs. And they had their firehouses. They had the boss of the firehouse, and then it was a point of pride to be the firehouse that put out the fire, right? So there were people who they had like front runners who would go to the scene of the fire and like take a barrel and sit on the water pump until their team got there, so that nobody else could put out the fire. Exactly. I mean, this is some of this is apocryphal, but a lot of it is true. And I mean, these are brass knuckle gang people who, they had rivalries with other firehouses, et cetera, et cetera. But even when Tammany got really egregiously nasty, and some of the fire departments who were running in to put out the fires were also stealing stuff. Like, oh, we'll put out your fire, but I like this lamp, Right. and there were people who worked for these volunteer fire departments who occasionally would, take some stuff. Even then, as opposed to the police department, which was roundly vilified from the beginning, the firefighters, they were always really respected because of the fact that they saved so many lives. I mean, they really did. Even when they were rowdy, even when they were brutal, these are people who are willing to, save the city over and over and over again. And it was a fascinating culture. Yeah, I found out all kinds of cool stuff about the fire department. And the fire museum is actually much better equipped than the police museum here in New York. So there's a lot of information there.
That's great. Well, what is your path? What was your path to becoming a writer before your first book was published? Did you always want to write, and what led you to writing that first novel?
Oh, this is a crazy story. No, it is. So I grew up loving books because my parents loved books, and so they were reading to me from when I was wee. I was reading like Shakespeare when I was 10, that kind of stuff. So I just always loved good stories. And I went to high school that had a great English teacher and a great drama department. So I was always really interested in acting, and I had this brilliant teacher in high school for advanced placement English and for a bunch of other English classes I took. His name was Jim Lamond. And for the AP English class, he called it 5 easy pieces, and he always did, his best Jack Nicholson when he was describing this class. 5 easy pieces meant that during the semester for AP English, what we had to do was write 5 things. The trick was that there were no due dates, and they weren't finished until he said they were. So we did about 8 drafts of each of the pieces, the 5 easy pieces, and he taught us how to self-edit, which was amazing. He taught everyone in these classes how to go through your own work and make it better. And I don't think that's a skill that a lot of people teach in high school, but Jim Lamond is brilliant. So he taught us all how to do that. And even by the time you got through 8 drafts of it, it might not get an A. but you would have, done this whole editorial process with it. So fast forward to college, and I couldn't give up either of them. So I was a double major in performance and in English. And after college, I worked for about 10 years as an actor, and they actually paid me money to sing and act on stage. It was bizarre. I'm still in the union. I mean, I'm kind of proud of that. Like, I actually, I did it a little bit. And I didn't get all that far, but I got into the union, and I got some great gigs, and I worked with a lot of Broadway people, and, I was really happy doing that for a while, but you don't really feel like you have any autonomy. And, you are constantly out of work, and you're constantly auditioning, and you're constantly saying, okay, well, am I good enough? You're just walking into rooms over and over again.
Right.
I was not smart enough to put on my own work or start my own theater company and cast all your friends in it, do something like, there's all kinds of examples of how this actually, is a much better idea, right? To put your own stuff together and then, start doing black box things. And, I wasn't smart enough. I was auditioning constantly, and I didn't have a lot of autonomy, and I was getting very discouraged. And of course I was working in restaurants that whole time. So the restaurant I was working at, it got forced out because it was in the meatpacking district, and that district of New York has really vastly changed since it packed meat. Now it's all Stella McCartney and ridiculousness, but they were going to turn this beautiful space I was working at in this restaurant into an Apple store, which is what's there now, which is a much better amount of rent, I imagine, for the people who actually own the land. So I was out of work, and I have always loved Sherlock Holmes. Since I first started reading Sherlock Holmes, it was one of those things where I started reading Sherlock Holmes and I never stopped reading Sherlock Holmes. Like, I had read the original 60 stories about a bajillion times at this point, and, it was a big part of my life, and my dad and I and my mom and my brother, we all watched the Jeremy Brett series, the Granada stuff, when it was, coming out in the 90s. We were totally Sherlock Holmes obsessed. So I pick up this book, and it is a Sherlock Holmes and Jack the Ripper pastiche. Mm-hmm. And it is, it's quite well written, and I'm just looking at it. This is on one of my breaks, on like possibly the last day I'm working at this restaurant. And it's not that dramatic, but it was toward the end. And I'm reading it on my break because I was working a double that day, and I'm just flipping through it, and I'm like, interesting, because it was Sherlock Holmes, Jack the Ripper, and a Transylvanian Satanist cult. And I was like, yes, of course, they lived in caves. Mm-hmm. Yep. So I'm reading through this, and I had this opinion for a while, but most Sherlock Holmes, Jack the Ripper stuff has what I call kitchen sink syndrome, mm-hmm. where you've got Sherlock Holmes, you've got Jack the Ripper, but Freemasons also. Or you've got Sherlock Holmes, Jack the Ripper, and the royal family, of course. Or you've got Sherlock Holmes, Jack the Ripper, and a cult of Transylvanian Satanists living underground in caves. So I asked myself the question, why do you need to add these kitchen sink elements to a Sherlock Holmes, Jack the Ripper narrative? Isn't it scary enough, I asked myself, that the serial killer was wandering around murdering a bunch of people pre-Freud? There was like no precedent for this. There had been serial killers in London previously, but never ones that were reported by the gutter press and like the information devoured by a fairly literate populace the way Jack the Ripper, this was unprecedented levels of just newspaper fodder, right?
Right.
And everyone was terrified, and everyone was using these murders for their own to argue their own political opinion. So I'm looking at this, and I'm like, what if someone wrote a Sherlock Holmes, Jack the Ripper novel that completely respected ripperologist point of view with the, like all of the, what if all of the evidence that's presented in a Sherlock Holmes Jack the Ripper novel were real? What if it were the Caleb Carr, the alienist version, essentially, of hunting a serial killer during this time period when you had no idea how to find this person, and obviously they didn't, unless something went down along the lines of him being secretly killed or found by the police. But all evidence suggests that the murders, they simply stopped. We're never going to know who Jack the Ripper was, and anybody who argues otherwise is probably wrong. So I had never seen that book, and in an act of enormous hubris, I decided I would write it myself. So I had a couple things going for me. First of all, like I was saying, I had been reading the Doyle mysteries for just over and over again forever.
Uh-huh.
And secondly, I was trained as an actor, so I was professionally trained as a mimic. Like, I can mimic people. I mean, I can do like 6 or 7 pretty solid accents. Maybe as many as 10 if I'm in practice. So, and this is just from the British Isles. so I when I set out to write it, I quite quickly was pretty happy with the fact that I thought that I could actually get the voice right, and that's something that it's very important to pastiches, and it's just a lot of love was poured into it, and I didn't think it was ever going to see the light of day. Other than I thought, well, maybe a Sherlockian small press will print this. I thought, I mean, people love Sherlock Holmes stuff. I'm putting a lot of research into this. I've been trained in dramatic 3-act structure. I've read a lot of books. I'm trying to get this right. So maybe, I thought to myself, some Sherlockian, publisher will print this.
Right.
So, so they knocked down the restaurant to build an Apple store, and I have 6 months unemployment, and I finished the thing because I thought I'll never have another opportunity to do this. Why not do it? I'm unemployed. I am looking definitely for gainful employment. However, I should at the same time finish this book. I finished the book. And then I applied all the methods my high school English teacher taught us. And I did I must have done, I think I did 5 drafts of that book, maybe more, before anyone ever saw it. I was going through with all of these systems, that he had taught us of how to make the thing better. So, I kept going through it and doing draft after draft. So I polished it like crazy. And then I seriously, I went to Barnes and Noble, and I went to the writing section, and I picked up a book like How to Write a Query Letter, and I was like, okay. This is ridiculous, though, right? So then nobody gets published like this. I know it's completely insane. So then I read a how-to book sitting there on the floor in Barnes and Noble on the carpet of how to write a query letter, and I'm like, okay, I can do that. So I go home, I write the query letter, and then I thought, just for fun, why don't you send this to a bunch of agents? That'll be neat. So I write the query letter, then I polish it like crazy again, the same way I was polishing the book. And I got a ridiculous amount of responses from agents, and I was shocked. And then
wow.
But it's very high concept, right? It's Sherlock Holmes, Jack the Ripper, but gritty, right? Because Sherlock Holmes, Jack the Ripper had been done countless times before. I mean, even in film. I mean, look at A Study in Terror and Murder by Decree came out something like, what were they, within 6-7 years of each other? I mean, A Study in Terror is 69, something like that, and then Murder by Decree is the Christopher Plummer one is mid-70s, something like that. And then you've got it's not only the film ones. I mean, you've got all of these just countless books, Sherlock Holmes, Jack the Ripper, because it makes perfect sense. I mean, Sherlock Holmes this is before Reichenbach, this is before all of the Moriarty stuff, 1888. I mean, he's still a young dude. Like, if Sherlock Holmes wasn't investigating the Ripper murders, who was? I mean, give me a break. It's right there, you know? But
Yep.
like, my version of it was very just dark. I guess I'm going to put it that way. So it was high concept enough for people to be like, okay, the elevator pitch in this query letter is really easy. Sherlock Holmes, Jack the Ripper in the style of The Alienist. Done. Like, you know, you can say that quite quickly.
Yeah.
So what happened was I get these responses back and I'm shocked. And then I signed up with Writer's House, which is an amazing agency. And I am working at another restaurant by then. But I walked in and I was like, guys, I just got an agent, a literary agent.
Wow.
And people were like, what? You know? And I'm like, yeah. And I'm wearing this ridiculous, like, you know, just black pants and a button up. It's a steakhouse, right? So like we all have to dress like men for some reason. Bizarre. Yeah. You know, you've got the beige button up, you know, shirt and then this, you know, black apron, and I'm walking around and I'm like, guys, I got a literary agent. And they're like, whoa, because people in the restaurant business are actually the best people in the entire world because all of us are doing something else.
Yeah, exactly.
And if you're not doing something else and you just want to be in the hospitality business, those are also the best people. So like, you know, it's great people in the restaurant world. So I get this literary agent and I'm still working at the steakhouse, working. And a couple months later, no, I guess it was maybe more like a month. My brand new agent sells the manuscript to Simon Schuster. And he calls me. I was at work. He was like, no, I was just off work. I went to the bookstore across the street. There was a Barnes & Noble there at the time. Oh, no, at Borders, excuse me. God, that's sad. There was a Borders across the street. I was in the Borders. And he's like, you should sit down. And I'm like, why? He goes, I just sold your book to Simon & Schuster for 6 figures. And I was like, oh. And it was crazy. It was completely crazy. And I went back to the restaurant and I told everyone and we had some champagne and I quit.
Wow.
And I'm just extraordinarily lucky to be able to do this. But that was the first experience. And I want to tell it exactly like it was, not in like a humble brag way, but in a sense, I want everyone to know. I just want everyone to know that if you didn't go to Yaddo, you know, like if you didn't go to Yale, if you have never been to a writer's retreat, if you've never taken a creative writing class, I've never taken a creative writing class. If you love something enough that you put a lot of passion and if you put a lot of work into it, and I always tell people I was extraordinarily lucky, and I was extraordinarily lucky, and I still am lucky to be able to do this for an actual living. I mean, it's ridiculous. This is absurd. I tell people, you know, you go out to a bar, people are like, oh, what do you do? I'm like, I'm a writer, and then they ignore you because they think you're a liar.
Right.
and then they're like, so you have a blog or something? And I'm like, no, I'm with Penguin Random House, GP Putnam.
That's great.
But
but
anyone can do it. I mean, I want people to know that if you work hard enough at it, you can do it. Just do it. You know, sit down.
So what advice would you have for aspiring writers who may be listening who would one day want to have their own novels published?
Well, read constantly. I mean, I think that's big. That's a huge thing. Read if you like a particular genre and you want to write in a particular genre, read everything you can from that genre and just, you know, learn what other people are doing in it. I think that's important. And I agree with Neil Gaiman about almost everything. Neil is lovely, but he's a great guy. But I agree with him. He said recently he was at BAM down in Brooklyn. I think this was only like last week. but he was talking about how to be a writer, of course, you have to write. You have to sit down and write, but you also have to finish things. And I think that that's true. I think that no matter how much practice you have at writing unfinished things, the act of finishing something is very important, because until you finish something, you can't do what I did and go back and edit it and make it better. So finishing things is very important. I mean, it's just sort of, I always say butt in chair. Just, you have to sit down and you have to do the writing, and then you have to come to the end of it, and then you have to go back and rework it to make it better. But anyone who has the drive, passion for books, and willingness to work really, really hard at it can do what I have done, because it should be a very egalitarian process, I think. I mean, I love Michael Chabon, and Michael Chabon has this great nonfiction collection called Maps and Legends, and I quote it constantly, but his very first essay in Maps and Legends is called Fan Fictions on Sherlock Holmes, and he's talking about how Pulitzer Prize winner Michael Chabon, author of The Amazing Adventures of Cavalier and Clay, etc., one of his first works when he was I think he said he was 10 or something like that, was he claims a terrible Sherlock Holmes pastiche. And I bet it wasn't terrible. I bet it was awesome. But he was, writing Sherlock Holmes stuff, and this essay is brilliant because he says all novels are sequels. And I think that's true to a large extent, because if you didn't love a book first, you would never sit down and write one. If you weren't passionate about reading things, you would never have the drive or the balls to sit down and write something like that yourself.
Right.
You have to be a reader first, I think. And I would just say to anybody who wants to write books, read constantly and finish things. And once you finish them, go back and make them better. And show them to people, get feedback, and just, make them as good as they possibly can be, because your first draft is always going to be total trash, but a first draft is better than no draft at all. I mean, my first drafts are ridiculous. The Fatal Flame, are you kidding me? So I had no idea when I was writing The Fatal Flame whether or not it was the third book in a series of 10 or 12 or, whatever, Timothy Wilde books, or if it was the third in a trilogy. And I learned as I was writing it that it was the third in a trilogy. It made emotional sense. There was this complete arc to it. And that doesn't mean I'm never going to revisit these characters. On the contrary, but one's narrated by Timothy. This is, this is the end of the trilogy. So I had no idea that this was the case while I was writing it. I was just waffling. It was ridiculous. So I don't have an outline when I set out to write. I often know, I guess I know what magicians call the prestige. I know what the hat trick is, right? I have the card up my sleeve. I know for instance, in The Gods of Gotham, I think we can be fairly spoiler-free saying that in The Gods of Gotham, it seems that there is a serial killer, which is not exactly the case. so that one's been out. But I know that, yes, exactly. Yeah. I knew that. And I knew what Valentine had on his conscience since they were children, in terms of the fire that he accidentally started that killed their parents. I knew that from the beginning, and in fact, I wrote that scene first, where he's telling Timothy what happened. But what I don't know is all of the stuff in between, and I often don't know who. I know the hat trick, but I often don't know who did it. And so I'm writing The Fatal Flame, and it hit 150,000 words. Oh my God, it was awful. So just as an example, 150,000 words. God, that's ridiculous. That's something along the lines. So Hound of the Baskervilles is a novel-length Sherlock Holmes mystery. Hound of the Baskervilles is 80,000 words. Just picture double the length of Hound of the Baskervilles of just me trying to figure out who did it and whether or not this is the end of a trilogy or the third in a series of however many.
Right.
So, like by the time you get to the end of that process and you just want to, and I finished it and I just wanted to curl up in a sock drawer and sleep for the rest of my life. But, like once you've got that finished, was that draft awful? Yes. but it existed. So like once you've finished the draft, if it's terrible, it doesn't matter how terrible it is. All you have to do at that point is go back into it and say, okay, now I'm going to fix it. Now I'm going to turn it into something that people actually might possibly pick up and want to read. So yeah, that's the trick, is to finish things.
Gotcha. So you've talked a lot about reading. Are there novels or nonfiction books that you've read recently that you would want to recommend that really made an impact on you?
Sure. I mean, there are so many great books in the world. Who's the author of The Fair Fight? The Fair Fight is outstanding. I just finished The Fair Fight. It's this great account of it's a set in England in the 19th century, early 19th century, I believe, and it is about female boxers. Oh my God, so great! I love it. The Fair Fight. I can't recall the author's name at the moment, and I apologize. I love everything Tana French puts out. Tana French is brilliant. And her stuff is contemporary Irish, but she's just lyrical and like really, really lovely prose. There's a sort of trifecta of us who write specifically historical mystery thrillers that sort of touch on great literary characters from classic literature, and involve them in our plot. So the three of us, one of them is Matthew Pearl, and he's great. He wrote the Dante Club, probably best known for that, but he just came out with a new one called The Last Buccaneer, which deals with Robert Louis Stevenson when he was living on an island, like in total isolation, towards the end of his life with his family, and he went hardcore native. So they're hoping the Buccaneers, essentially, it's about people who were trying to get their hands on manuscripts, essentially, book sharks, and it's fascinating. So that's brand new, out from Matthew. And the other one of the two of us who we all sort of work in the same of is Louis Bayard, and Louis Bayard he's outstanding, just great. His first one, Mr. Timothy, I have no idea why more people have not read this. Everyone should read this book. It's just and then just continue reading all of Louis' books because they're awesome. But Mr. Timothy is essentially a pastiche about the grown-up Timothy Cratchit from A Christmas Carol, and there's a whole mystery thriller element. He's solving a crime, but he's also getting over a lot of like emotional baggage from being financially dependent on Uncle Ebenezer, and apparently a lot of the stuff that he supposedly said that was angelic, his dad Bob Cratchit was just making up. so he's got a lot of stuff to unpack. I love that book because it plays with our perceptions of classic characters, and that always is great. My friend Suzanne Rindle, other typist, is outstanding, and she's got a new one that is going through edits now. There's a lot of books out there that are wonderful, and it becomes sort of a question of like, what do I have to read for work, and when do I find the time to read, just for me? Because I'm very flattered whenever anyone sends me an early, sort of copy of something, asking for a blurb, that sort of thing. One of the last ones I got was just outstanding. Church of Marvels. Church of Marvels is not out yet. And the author's name, of course, is escaping me again. But when Church of Marvels comes out, everyone needs to go read it instantly. It's a historical fiction, mystery, crime set in Coney Island in the 1890s. And then it sort of moves to Manhattan, and it's back and forth with carnival folk who have been performing out on Coney Island on the boardwalk for years. And then, these tragic events happen, and someone goes missing, and it's got multiple narrators. The voice is perfect. Church of Marvel is outstanding. So sometimes I'm, sent things where I read them and I'm like, oh my God, I'm so happy that I was just sent this. And then, other times I'm thinking to myself, well, I would really, I would love to read the new ton of French, but I don't have time. So yeah, I marvel at the quality of books that come out every year. I mean, obviously America puts out more books than any other nation, hands down. I mean, so there's just scores of great books that are coming out constantly, and that's wonderful, but it also makes it a little bit difficult sometimes.
Exactly. So what are you working on now? Have you started a new book?
Well, I have.
And if you don't want to talk about it, that's obviously fine.
No.
Okay.
It's fine. I have a book that's coming out in April of 2016 that's finished, and that's a standalone, and it's called Jane Steele. So Jane Steele essentially is a book about a young woman named Jane Steele who is reading Jane Eyre during the time period that Jane Eyre was having its heyday. It's 1850, the second edition with the scathing preface to her detractors has just come out. And everyone's reading Jane Eyre, and the narrator of this book loves Jane Eyre. And she's telling a very parallel story. She has also had experience of being in a terrible household where no one wants her. Then she's sent to a terrible boarding school. Then, she ends up at this mysterious house with this mysterious fellow, et cetera, et cetera. So it's very parallel plot to Jane Eyre, and that's one of the reasons that she loves the book so much. But Jane Steele, I asked myself the question, what if a young woman were told over and over and over and over again, as Jane Eyre was told, you're irredeemable, you're wicked, you're vile, you're, completely amoral, and you are probably going to go to hell. What if instead of, as Jane Eyre did, saying, no, I have my own moral compass, I know I'm a good person. What if instead the girl said, I could own that. So it's essentially Jane Eyre meets darkly dreaming Dexter. She's a serial killer. But she kills people that you don't really want to be around.
That's convenient.
So she's quite a sympathetic murderer. The end of the prologue is, reader, I murdered him. So it's a riff on Jane Eyre that goes along parallel lines, but way more fatalities. Essentially.
That's great.
So that's what's out in 2016.
Great. Well, again, we've been speaking with Lyndsay Faye. Her latest novel, The Fatal Flame, has just been published, so go grab a copy today. And Lyndsay, thanks for taking the time to do this interview.
Oh, my pleasure. Thank you so much for having me.
You should be saving for the future, but savings accounts suck, and investing can be scary. We combine the ease of savings with the real returns of investing. We call it Save Vesting, and it's only available in our new app, Stairs. Stairs offers 4 to 6% returns, no fees, and you can withdraw anytime. Do your future a favor. Visit stairsapp.com today.